I'm delighted to be here, and I was saying earlier, it's been a while since I've actually spoken as Helen. I've been doing reenactments of Jessie Jack Hooper and speaking as if I were Jessie. I've been studying Jessie Jack Hooper since 2003. I actually looked through my notes to prepare for this, and then a colleague in the history department at UW Oshkosh told me about this woman from Oshkosh who was involved with both suffrage and Indian policy reform. And what I had done my dissertation on eons ago was on women in Indian policy reform. And here was a woman I had not heard of because I had focused on other parts of the country. So that was how I got introduced to Jessie, and I found her truly fascinating. And after 30 years of teaching, I had my first sabbatical in 2005, and my project was to start research on a biography of Jessie. And I got just totally hooked. I was enjoying what I was doing. I said, this is what I'm meant to do at this stage in my life. So when I came back from my sabbatical, I said, I will be leaving after the 1 year that I owe you. And that was 2007, and I have been working on this on and off and doing other things like leading Sierra Club trips and other distractions, but I'm still very involved in writing a biography of Jessie Jack Hooper, and I hope I get it done soon. I have been reinvigorated by the amount of attention the suffrage centennial has brought to Jessie and to the whole thing. I think she would be truly amazed that a century later people are excited about this and coming to in large numbers to different events in Madison and here, and it's really exciting to see people honoring the struggles that women like Jessie went through. Now, I wanted to give kind of a brief overview of her life. I've been talking so much about the suffrage chapter of her life that if I sometimes get started on suffrage, I just keep spinning on suffrage. So I will give it somewhat short attention here, but I'd be happy to be much more detailed if you want in any questions afterwards. But the title that Sandy helped me come up with was an inspiring and inspired life. And Jessie's life was inspired, and in some ways it was really inspired by Oshkosh and the people that she met here. She had grown up in rural northeastern Iowa, and she married Ben Hooper, who was a lawyer from Oshkosh. Her sister had also married a man from Oshkosh, and so that was how Jessie met Ben when she was visiting her sister. And they were one of these couples that are just made for each other. It was really a very happy marriage. And Ben had gone to law school at Columbia in New York. He was from a prominent, his father was a very prominent attorney for Kimberly-Clark and had argued his cases at the Supreme Court, including when he was in his 90s. So a very prominent family. And Ben was also a very open-minded and big-hearted person. And he was very encouraging for Jessie to grow. Shortly after they were married, he said, it's not fair that only I can vote. And so he offered to vote her ticket every other election and his own in the other one, which is a beneficence that you don't usually hear. And he also encouraged her to join women's organizations. Now, in the late 1800s, women's organizations were very important, and they were somewhat new. Middle-class women were getting together. They had enough leisure time that they could generally get out of the house for some time in the afternoon or on Saturdays, and they were thinking about issues and thinking about their own personal growth. Many of the clubs were called department clubs, and they had very different sections of the club. Some clubs would have art and music and literature and sort of more academic topics. Others would have community-oriented topics. And Jessie joined the Ladies Benevolent Association, which was a charitable organization started in the Civil War era. But by the late 1800s, when she joined, they were building what they called a home for the friendless, a home for mostly older Civil War widows. They had friends when they were younger, but they outlived their friends in their communities. So she was very engaged with that project, and then joining the 20th Century Club, she got involved with the civics department, and they worked on things like building playgrounds to go with the schools and the parks, building ice rinks in the wintertime so that kids had a place to enjoy the benefits of the winter, and also looking to build a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients that was closer than Wales. Wisconsin was the only one in the state that was a public sanatorium. And so these projects helped get her into this a different mode of life. When she came to Oshkosh, she talked about being a social butterfly, kind of, when she came here. She had been sickly as a child, so her parents did not have her go to high school. She had a governess for a few years, but she had been sheltered, kind of, and she went to, they sent her to the south for the winters so that she would not get sick. And she said she had nothing to do, and so she did nothing. You know, she would read things, but that was about all. And when she got to Oshkosh, and there was this lively organizational life and interesting people that she met in the women's clubs who had expertise in a number of different areas, she just thrived. It really was a wonderful experience and a wonderful place for her. And so she was inspired by the opportunities that a big city, to her, Oshkosh was a big city, that this big city offered her, and she really took advantage and grew from that experience. Now, the work that she did with the women's organizations led directly into her involvement in women's suffrage, because many women, not only here, but nationwide, this same phenomenon was happening, that women were involved in reform movements, and they felt that they could get just so far, and then the legislators weren't listening to them. They didn't have the vote. They were not constituents, and so they didn't have to talk to the women. Why bother, you know? And so many of these women went and became active in the suffrage movement. And so in the early 20th century, when the progressive movement for municipal reform was growing and more women were involved in that, you see an upsurge in women's suffrage. People who were joining it now were people who historians call them social feminists. I think that that's not a great term, because I don't think they thought of themselves always as feminists, but they were inspired to work for equal women's rights because they felt the need of it, and they felt that they needed the vote not only to recognize their political equality, but to use the vote. They wanted the vote as a tool to help them win other successes that they wanted to achieve and try to transform the society to be closer to their own ideals. So women like Jessie in Oshkosh, there was a whole group of women. Sophie Guden was an immigrant from Germany, was very highly educated, and she was the state president of the National Consumers League, and their activity, their mission was to instruct women to look at who made this stuff that they were buying, to really look at, was this made by sweatshop labor? You don't want to buy something that's by sweatshop labor. You want to buy something that's union made or something like that. But Sophie Guden was from a very high-class, privileged family in Germany, but became a very strong advocate for working women and getting better pay and better hours and conditions for women. So this was one of the people who inspired Jessie right here in Oshkosh. And Jessie and Sophie Guden, another woman named Rose Swart, who, if you've been on the UWO campus, you've seen Swart Hall, and that's named after Rose Swart, who was a faculty member who was very instrumental in developing the teacher education program, setting up the student teachers and making sure they had one-to-one mentoring, both in their schoolroom and when they got back to campus. So she was, Guden and Swart spoke out when they were having a hearing in 1911 at the Wisconsin State Legislature about a referendum to have the electorate of Wisconsin, the all-male electorate of Wisconsin, vote on whether or not to allow women to vote as well. And this was written into the state constitution of Wisconsin in 1848, that any time a class of people would be welcomed into the electorate, it had to be by the vote of the people who were already voting. So Jessie and Sophie Guden, they would not have liked me calling them all the time by their first names. I should say something about that. In their era, women tended to call each other, even friends, Mrs. Jones or Mrs. Hooper, whatever. They were much more formal about things. And so I'm sure that Jessie would rather I referred to her all the time as Mrs. Hooper, but I feel too close to her for that, so I always call her Jessie. Anyway, there was a strong group of women right from Oshkosh who were very committed to working to win that referendum, and they went down to Milwaukee and joined a new club that was called the Political Equality League, and this was a more forceful approach to working for suffrage, standing on street corners and standing in cars. At one point, Jessie was speaking from a car, and the car she was speaking from got hit. It was in a car accident, and she kept speaking. And it was just, I think, remarkable. I don't know that I would have had the peace of mind to do that, but they were very committed, and they really wanted to get this referendum passed. But the powers that be in the state, particularly the liquor interests, were worried about women getting the vote and being pro-prohibition and ruining their business. And so they worked hard behind the scenes to make it harder for women to win that referendum. In the ballot for the election included a white ballot with all the other issues like referendums on one sheet, and then the suffrage referendum was on a separate pink ballot. And so the people who ran taverns could tell their people, vote no on the pink ballot. And there were actually, in that election, the women's suffrage went down by a 2-to-1 margin. And there were more pink ballots voted against women's suffrage than any other candidate received or any other issue received. You know, so that there had been just a concerted effort to get those pink ballots out, or else they were stuffing the pink ballot box, I don't know. But Jessie and her colleagues were very frustrated by the outcome of that, but committed. This was 1912, and in 1912 they felt that the lowest of the low. They really felt defeated, but they were determined that they would turn things around. And by 1919, Wisconsin was the first state to ratify the federal women's suffrage amendment. So that's an enormous change in a short period of time. And I think it highlights an issue that I want to emphasize, is that women's suffrage was an educational process for the women who were involved in it. Just like the women's clubs, they were learning things about parliamentary procedures and learning how to get something done through the legislature, etc. In women's suffrage, they were learning how to shape public opinion, how to lobby, how to write letters to people and get people of influence to write letters to other people to support their cause. Jessie became very active. She was the lead lobbyist for the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association and worked very hard to change the legislature's minds and to encourage people to push for people who were pro-suffrage to be put into the legislatures, to vote in people who would vote for suffrage. So the work of the women's suffrage people made this change happen in a relatively short period of time. And people like Jessie, Jessie was the vice president and lobbyist for the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association, and Henrietta Yeomans was the president. Henrietta was, no, it's Theodora, I'm sorry, Theodora Yeomans. She was a former newspaper woman, and still, she was a former reporter, but now she was an editor of the Waukesha Freeman. She was from Waukesha, and wrote a suffrage column and was very important in changing people's minds through the written word. Jessie was more of an orator, and she went and gave, and Sophie Guden also gave speeches all over to any size group trying to change people's minds. And they did succeed. In 1919, when the Senate finally voted to approve the federal women's suffrage amendment and send it out to the states for ratification, Jessie was ready in the Wisconsin legislature to convince them to send this thing through quickly and get it to Washington quickly so they'd be the first state to win. And they were. The man who had proposed the law for the suffrage referendum was in the chamber of the legislature to see it finally ratification happen. And his daughter had worked with Jessie in suffrage early. The daughter, Ada James, had moved to the radical wing of the suffrage movement, and Jessie was more in the moderate wing, but they collaborated and got Ada's father, David James, the former senator from in Wisconsin legislature, ready with the signed paper from the governor to take it to Washington and to get there before Illinois, who had actually voted for suffrage first. They voted for it an hour earlier. So Jessie was thrilled. This was probably one of the high points of her life, that to see something that she worked so hard for actually come to fruition is really a fabulous thing. And she saw that it was their intense work. They worked very hard on this and very collaboratively, and that succeeded. And she carried this theme through. After suffrage, what had been the National Women's Suffrage Association transformed itself into the League of Women Voters. And Carrie Chapman Capp had been the leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She was Jessie's mentor. Jessie just thought she was the best mind that she had ever encountered. She had a very good strategic mind. She could plan things and understand how to get this problem solved, and she would have been a great general, Jessie would say. She'd get people lined up to do what she wanted done, and it would work, you know, whatever. She had a very good mind for that. But the League of Women Voters was made explicit what Jessie had experienced in the women's clubs, in that women could be working together and learning from each other and learning to be good citizens, learning to explore an issue and find out the pros and cons of an issue, and then let people make up their minds about it. They learned how to research the candidates who were running for office and what is their stand on some of these issues, and should we not endorse some of these people? The League of Women Voters was nonpartisan. It was not affiliated with either party, and so women in the League were learning about the process of government and about how to be an active citizen. And Jessie believed in this wholeheartedly. She also believed that given the vote, that was one of the rights associated with being a full citizen. But citizenship also involved duties. And one of the things that Jessie fought for when she was in charge of, she was the first state president of the League of Women Voters, she pushed for allowing women to serve on juries. Now, many other states exempted women from serving on juries just because they were women, and they should be protected from learning about the bad things that go on in society. And Jessie thought that was an artificial protection, and most of the women in the Wisconsin League of Women Voters agreed with her, and they convinced the legislature. So Wisconsin was one of the first states that allowed women to serve on juries. And Jessie was proud of that, the sense that women could have the rights of citizenship, but also fulfilled the duties of citizenship. And that brings up a new thing. She became the first president of the League of Women Voters in 1920. In 1922, just about this time of year, the Wisconsin Democratic Party was having its convention, and she had a call at home out of the blue. She didn't know that had some leanings toward the Democratic Party, but she had not been active because she was in a nonpartisan organization, and it was very important for her not to show partisanship. Anyway, the Democrats called her up and said, "Would you like to run for U.S. Senate against Fighting Bob La Follette?" Now, his name is still remembered in Wisconsin history as one of the leaders of this time period. He had been for a couple of terms, the governor of the state. He had been senator for, I think, at least 2 previous terms, and he was running again for U.S. Senate. Now, Jessie, when she was offered this opportunity, felt, well, in some ways it's a citizen's duty, if you're asked and you are able to do it, to serve in a legislative thing, and it certainly would be an honor. But what really got her was that she wanted there to be a woman's voice in the U.S. Senate, and she would particularly like a woman's voice to be someone like her rather than someone like La Follette. And the problem that she saw with La Follette, he was very much against President Wilson's push for the Versailles Treaty and the League of Nations. And he was the leader that pushed the Senate against the U.S. ratifying that Versailles Treaty or entering the League of Nations. And Jessie was a real believer in international organizations to preserve peace. While she was involved with women's suffrage, World War I was declared in 1917, and she and the organization that she was involved with, the suffrage organization, worked both for suffrage and for supporting the war effort. And she did that with patriotic zeal and believed in what she was doing. She raised money for war bonds. She was very active in this. But at the end of the war, she felt, we worked so hard for this to be the war that ends all wars. But then people's commitment to building peace machinery rather than war machinery seemed to drop off after the war. So she wanted to bring a woman's voice for peace into the Senate. And she said, I know it's a long shot. It's a ridiculous long shot. La Follette is the most famous politician in the state. But he's an older man. Who knows? There could be some fluke and I might win. So she took on the challenge, and Ben was very supportive of that. He said, you know, if you really want to do this, you should do it. And he gave the first donation to her campaign. Interestingly, the Democrats wanted somebody to run, but they didn't give her any money. They didn't give her any support. They made some posters for her, and they sent her a bill, which is just, you know, when was looking through her papers and saw this bill for, 25 posters. I said, are you kidding? It's unbelievable that they wanted somebody to be on the ballot, but they thought they could win some women's approval by nominating a woman. Jessie took her campaign very seriously. She wrote a platform and she went all over the state speaking. She had a very dedicated core of volunteers, many of whom she had known through suffrage, who worked for her campaign. But Wisconsin was then largely a one-party state. It was mostly Republican. And when the votes were counted, she had earned more votes than any other Democrat running for a statewide office, but she still lost by a landslide. But she wasn't sorry that she did it, because she felt that she had proven that a woman could be a credible candidate. She was never heckled. She felt she carried herself with dignity, and she expected people to be respectful, and they were. So she was very proud of the way she had conducted the campaign, but she was very sad the way that it came out. But it led to some soul searching. She had to resign as the president of a nonpartisan League of Women Voters when she took on the candidacy. And she was wondering, what should I do with my life now? The most important issue that she had, in addition now to women's suffrage was this issue of world peace. And many of the people who had been involved in suffrage moved on to the issue of world peace. There was a peace movement in the 1920s and 30s. And a lot of the suffrage people felt that time was ripe now to change. We saw how horrible World War I was, just misery on a level that had not been known before, and photographed, and it entered people's consciousness in a very real way. And Jessie felt that the whole time she was raising money for war bonds, she was promising the boys fighting in France that they would be remembered, and this would be the war to end all wars. And they were still talking about building new bombs and things like that. And so she wanted this to be her cause. And she wrote to her old mentor, Carrie Chapman Catt, and said, what can I do? Can you think of something that I could make a real significant contribution to this cause of world peace? And so Catt said, well, right now the League of Women Voters has a separate section that's working on world peace, and you should be active in that, and she was. But then Catt came to Oshkosh just to visit Jessie a year later and talked about what she could do for world peace. And she thought that they had in Washington all the different women's organizations, like the League of Women Voters, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, the YWCA, different missionary associations from different religions, the National Jewish Council. All of these women's organizations had representatives in Washington, and they got together and developed a kind of common agenda, a common political or legislative agenda all the members of those organizations would be fighting for. So it brought the idea of organized womanhood. All these separate women's organizations were now meta-organized, organized even more to work together, to focus their attention on common goals. And Catt said, we should do that for peace. We should get all these women's organizations to join a coalition that would be women fighting for peace. And it's not just, it's ordinary women. It's not women who are very highly placed. These organizations involved people from small towns. The General Federation of Women's Clubs, there were women's clubs in every little town all across the country. And these were women like Jessie felt herself. She did not feel that she was a particularly gifted, special person. She felt she was sort of an every woman. And she wanted all these everyday women to get together and work for peace the way she had seen them work for suffrage. And so she and Kat came up with the idea that at the next League of Women Voters convention, which was in Buffalo, New York in 1924, in April, I think, they would have representatives, invite all these representatives from these different organizations and talk about some kind of a group working for peace. And what they came up with was having a conference in Washington, D.C., where they would have diplomats and professors teach the women about the causes of war. Why do wars happen? And then try to come up with cures. And so they called it the Conference on the Cause and Cure of War. And it sounds so odd to us today. We don't think of war as something that you can cure. But that's how they were really trying to think of it. How can we cure the world of this disease of war? And they had that first conference. They held it in D.C. And after the women had a list of books that they were to read before they came to the conference. It was a very structured kind of thing, and all the different organizations came together. And afterwards, they would go to speak to their representatives, their senators and their representatives in Congress, and said, we are really serious about world peace, and what are you doing about the U.S. entering the World Court, or the Kellogg-Briand Pact that's supposed to say all the nations who sign this peace accord will work to have any international conflict settled by arbitration. These were the sorts of issues they were debating. And they would lobby their Congress people about this and show that everyday women are really concerned about peace. And so this conference lasted after Jessie had died. It continued on, but it was an annual event, and many women were involved in this. And Jessie's high point in this era was in 1928, that Kellogg-Briand Treaty that I mentioned. That was coming up for ratification. The Senate has to ratify any treaty that the U.S. enters in. And the women had talked to their senators in the morning, some day in January, I don't remember the date, in 1928. And then in the afternoon, the senators passed ratification that the U.S. would sign this Kellogg-Briand Pact. And Jessie was so worried that the people, by then Senator La Follette had died, but the group of senators who had opposed the entry into the League of Nations, she was really worried that they would gain the ascendancy. But the tide of world peace sentiment was very strong at the time. And so this was one of her happiest days in the last period of her life. After that Kellogg-Briand Treaty, Jessie was then voted the International Relations Chair for the entire General Federation of Women's Clubs, the organization that all women's clubs in the country belong to. And Jessie had the idea that she could bring this entire million strong organization into the commitment that she felt toward world peace. And so she was trying to do this with a woman who was the president at the time, who was from a military family and was not really that interested in world peace. So she was struggling very hard. But she and other organizations that this coalition was working on had been introduced to a organization called the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was a more radical activist organization that focused on peace. And they had worked with other countries, women in other countries, and there was to be a Geneva Peace Conference in 1932, and they wanted to have the women of the world petition the Geneva Peace Conference saying, we support peace. Whatever you do for peace, the women of the world are behind you. And Jessie thought, this is something I could get the women's clubs involved with. They would like to join with the women in the world and support peace. So she pledged that she would collect 1 million signatures for this petition for supporting the Geneva Peace Conference. Do you have any idea how much paper it takes to have 1 million signatures? It was monumental. She hadn't realized that the General Federation of Women's Clubs didn't have 1 million people anymore, because this was 1932, and 1929 was when the Depression, the stock market tanked. And by 1932, it was pretty much the depth of the Depression. And one of the things that, even though the dues for these clubs were not tremendously high, but one of the things that happens when your paychecks begin to disappear is that you drop things like your membership in organizations. And also, she had thought, well, we have 1 million here in the General Federation of Women's Clubs, but the AAUW was also collecting signatures, and some of the women were in both, and if they signed the AAUW, they shouldn't sign these. So she only came up with 618,000 signatures, and she was glad for that many, but it was the most that any organization had. And so she was given the honor of being the one who would take the American collected petitions to Geneva and take part in a ceremony that they had to show the delegates to the Geneva Conference. This is all the women of the world saying you should do your job and get world peace going. So she was very pleased. She had not been to Europe before. It was really one of the peak experiences of her life to be at that ceremony. And afterwards, she was asked to speak on the radio to be broadcast all the way from Geneva to the United States to explain about this, what they were doing in Geneva, and about the ceremony that she had just attended. And this was really a marvelous honor for her. She was sad, though, because the radio in her house wasn't working and Ben didn't hear her speak. But it was really one of the high points, again, of her life. And she was very pumped when she got home. She wanted to go on a state-by-state tour of the whole country, go to all the different women's clubs that had sent in petitions and talk about this and how we can follow up with this. But her first stop was Washington, D.C., and as she was leaving her hotel room, she tripped and broke her ankle very badly, and had a hard time even getting back. She had to have surgery on it, had a hard time getting back to Wisconsin, and had a long, slow convalescence. And after that, she contracted stomach cancer. And so she died very, very sadly. She had all these goals and hopes for being able to succeed with peace as she had with suffrage. And to see this worldwide women get together was just so wonderful to someone who believed in the power of organized womanhood. And she didn't get to see it bloom. And I'm glad in some ways. It would have been very hard for someone who was that committed to peace to see what happened in the subsequent years when World War II happened. It would have been very hard for her to live through that. But I wanted to spend the time today giving you the whole of Jessie's life. I've been talking about her suffrage chapter, and I think that's fascinating. But I think it's important to see that she really continued to grow for, as long as she possibly could, and to try to do what she could to make the world a better place. She was inspired by Oshkosh, but she also hoped to inspire others to be as committed to their beliefs and their issues, and to work for them. Thank you very much for being a good, attentive audience. I appreciate it. If anybody have questions, you can clap if you want. Such a small audience. Thank you. Any questions? Kathy?
You said early on that you and she were interested in Native American.
Yes.
Women's rights, progress. Tell us a little bit about what she did.
Okay, yeah, it was an interesting story. It wasn't one of the things that she devoted an enormous amount of time to, but it was something that became a very important and consistent part of her life in the 1920s. She was, in the 1920s, in general, in the United States, the tide had been in Indian policy reform to push assimilation, to send all the Indian children to boarding schools and not allow them to speak their languages and try to turn them into just plain Americans. It wasn't working very well, and in the 1920s, a new group of people involved in Indian affairs pushed for allowing Indian people to have some degree of self-determination, to have schools on the reservation so that the families could stay together, to have a sense of their own, valuing their own culture, not to insist that they be Christianized or converted to Christianity. So there were, Jessie was allied with the people who were involved with John Collier became the director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs under Roosevelt, and he was the leader of this group. So Jessie was committed to being involved with the Native people of Wisconsin who were pushing for their rights. And she got started in this, I think, when in 1924, American Indians were all given the right to vote. That sounds truly ridiculous, that these most native of our people did not have automatic citizenship by birth. You know, wouldn't you think that they would have it? But they were not considered citizens in the same way. And so in 1924, she was not the president of the League anymore, but she was still a very prominent member of the League, and she worked to help establish some branches of the League of Women Voters on a couple of the reservations in Wisconsin. One was the Menominee, and then she worked with a woman named Lily Oshkosh, who was actually married to a descendant of Chief Oshkosh, who the town was named for. And Jessie taught Lily Oshkosh how to lobby. She worked with her and gave her directions. You know, you have to. Jessie used a lot of her social skills that she had developed in her social butterfly stage in order to be good at lobbying. She would listen to the person, find out what they were interested in, and say, you know, if you're interested in that, you should think about this for women's suffrage, for women. She just was very good at that. And she got involved with Lily Oshkosh, and Lily Oshkosh helped the Menominee fight off something that the government was trying to do. The Menominee had control over their forest and their wood lumbering industry, and they had a sustainable forest when it was hardly even an idea. But she helped them, and she was prominent enough that if there was a hearing, she would go to a hearing and they would often say, "Oh, Mrs. Hooper, do you have something you'd like to say?" And she said, "Well, I would like to give my chance to speak to Lily Oshkosh," because she wanted the Native people to be heard rather than her. So she was an intermediary, and every year when she was in Washington for the conference on the cause and cure of war, she would lobby, speak up. She'd get a list from the people that she knew on the reservations, what their issues were, and she would go to the Board of Indian Affairs, the Indian Commissioner's office, and speak what their needs were. You know, so she became kind of an intermediary, and she was asked by the Native women in the branches that had been established to be their liaison, to be the state chair, the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin's chair of Indian Affairs, and she did that for the rest of her life. You know, that she was just involved with that. So it wasn't something that she devoted an enormous part of her life for, but it was important, and I think it shows another side of her, that she was supportive of people who were different, you know, as well as people who were ordinary. Any other questions? Good question. Well, I thank you for your attention and for coming out on this stormy night, although it seems to have stopped raining, so that's a good thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.